Hi, everyone. This is Devin Zuber in Berkeley, California. Thanks so much for signing up to take this mini course at Convention on Swedenborg at the Cinema. I'm really glad that you're here. And my small lecture now in advance of our time together later in June is both historical, excavating the surprising presence of Swedenborgian ideas in the history of film and cinema, but it's also theological. I want us to be thinking about how the form of movies themselves might give us insight into Swedenborg's theology. Is there something cinematic about Swedenborg's writings themselves? So I want to start with some general reflections on this before moving into cinema history in the second part of my lecture, where we'll actually look at some images and some clips. So I've actually had this as a sort of preoccupation or thought experiment for a very long time, perhaps going back to when I was a teenager and starting to read Swedenborg on my own. I grew up in a Swedenborgian family, and I had especially strong grandmothers who loved talking about doctrine over a good cup of tea in their kitchens. And as a budding young reader of Swedenborg, I was always interested in the so-called memorabilia, the memorable relations, these accounts of visionary experience related by Swedenborg of the things seen and heard, as he puts it, in the spiritual world. These were colorful, enlivening descriptions that interspersed between the chapters the more dry, rational exegesis and theology. And some of this material, as those of you know who've spent time reading Swedenborg, is highly imagistic and visionary, things which aren't immediately explicable that Swedenborg is seeing and hearing. A lot of it sometimes feels like the opening of a film, perhaps, where you're not really sure what is precisely going on. Take, for example, this memorabilia from True Christian Religion, or True Christianity, as we now call it, following the New Century edition, number 462. And I'm going to read this out loud. Maybe you can imagine in your minds, how would this moment in Swedenborg's writings look and sound like cinema? I looked over to a seacoast in the spiritual world. There I saw a magnificent harbor. I went to it and I examined it more closely. There were large and small sea vessels carrying merchandise of every different kind. Boys and girls were sitting on them, distributing the wealth of the ships to anyone who wanted it. They said, "We are waiting to see our beautiful sea turtles. They will soon be coming up out of the ocean to us." Then I saw the sea turtles, large and small. They had little baby sea turtles riding on their shells, looking around at the surrounding islands. The parent turtles had 2 heads. One head was large and was covered in a shell, like the shell on their body, which made them look reddish. The other head was small, like a normal turtle's head. They would retract this smaller head into the front part of their body. By an unseen method, they would also put this smaller head inside the larger head. I kept my focus, however, on their large reddish heads. I noticed that these heads had faces like that of human beings. These heads were talking with the boys and the girls on the seaboats and licking the children's hands. Then the boys and girls began stroking the sea turtles on their shells, and they gave them things, rich, wonderful food, also expensive gifts such as silk for clothing, cypress wood for building material, purple cloth for beautification, and scarlet dye for dyeing silk. I love this memorable relation because it's Swedenborg's style at its most cinematic. It almost could be a description of a surrealist film by Salvador Dali or Louis Buñuel from the 1930s. I'd like to argue, or take up as a thought experiment, though, that more than stylistics and this kind of imagistic visionary content we find throughout Swedenborg, we might think about how Swedenborg's whole approach to reading the Bible might work akin to the ways that we experience film and movies. Swedenborg's radical innovations in exegesis, in the interpretation of Scripture, was to restore a profoundly emotive dimension. The words of sacred Scripture were not just old historical accounts written by ancient dead tribes of people, but a celestial script about our own inner transformation, our path of regeneration to the divine. Reading the Word, the Bible, through correspondences becomes a journey about our own experiences with divine love and our struggles with lightness and with the darkness that we carry and are born into. So think of that hermeneutic. And now think of a really good, powerful movie that you've seen. Maybe even, if you are brave enough to be open and honest, a film that has brought you to tears and made you cry. Why? What was it in the story or the cinematography that moved you to tears? Maybe it was a feeling of compassion or sympathy or empathy for a plight or a dilemma that was portrayed. But maybe it was also because the film revealed something about your character, who you are, and you found part of your own journey mirrored and refracted in the film. The philosopher George Steiner, in his beautiful book, Real Presences, writes about how the best works of art contain a kind of transcendent residue that makes us wish we had lived a better life when we come away from the work of art, be it a film or reading a novel or a powerful poem. That there's a presence of something unrepresentable that is beyond art or language to capture or convey in these artworks. In the Swedenborgian tradition, the reading of sacred scripture is supposed to do something akin to this. We read it because it helps us in our regeneration. More than providing course correction or a roadmap to heaven, in profound and deeply symbolic ways, it models how our mind, our spirit, relates to the Lord. And this, of course, is the heart of Swedenborg's whole reading of Genesis as not an actual literal account of how the natural world came into being, but a deep and profound allegory in a fundamentally transformative way about our growth and movement back into the divine love and wisdom of the Lord. Besides George Steiner, another thinker here who's been important for my thoughts about this has been the writer and filmmaker Nathaniel Dorsky, who in a wonderful small book called Devotional Cinema writes about how movies can function in an almost sacred way. And to view them is actually, in his words, a devotional practice. There is, as he says, a concordance between films and our human spiritual metabolism. There is a concordance between films and our human spiritual metabolism. We could almost substitute there the word correspondence in the Swedenborgian sense, I think. Movies, Dorsky says a little bit later in the book, have an almost talismanic power to mirror and realign our metabolism. Now, sorry, Grandma, but who would have ever have thought that watching movies might actually be something good for you? And there is certainly something like too much of a good thing. Anyone who has binge watched a Netflix or HBO series, The Wire, Game of Thrones, or the like, staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning thinking just one more episode, usually lives to regret this the next morning. Okay, so we now move into part 2 of my lecture, Spiritual Cinema, Swedenborg at the Movies, where we will go more into the roots of how Swedenborgian thought is entangled with the foundation of modern cinema and modern avant-garde video art, if we want to call it that, as well as the filmmaker Ingmar Bergman and the way he uses certain Swedenborgian ideas in his later film productions of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. The first person we need to talk about is this fellow, Vachel Lindsay from the Midwest. He was a modernist poet and a deep reader of Swedenborg. He first came to read Swedenborg's writings through Ralph Waldo Emerson and William Blake, two very important poets and writers and artists who shaped Lindsay's thinking about visionary art. And some of you might know Vachel Lindsay's long cycle of poems on Johnny Appleseed, a figure he was sort of obsessed with. Lindsay was very interested in the legacy of Swedenborgian thought in American countercultures that resisted the status quo, that had an utopian impulse. Lindsay said he was, quote, very glad Johnny Appleseed was a Swedenborgian because a good Swedenborgian is a better enemy of economic tyranny than any economist. Lindsay is relevant to our lecture today because in 1916, he published what is widely regarded as the first book of film criticism in English in the United States, The Art of the Moving Picture, which came out during the middle of World War I in 1916. This book attempts to treat the burgeoning film industry as not just popular culture and kitsch, entertainment for the masses, as many art historians and art critics regarded it, but actually as an art form that was on par with the best painting, sculpture, and architecture. Sounding a bit like the much later Nathaniel Dorsey in the devotional cinema book that I read from earlier, Lindsay also completely sacralizes the experience of watching film. And we should remember it wasn't called film then or even movies. The preferred term in Lindsay's book is photoplay. The photoplay was a sacred art form. He often talks about the cathedral mood of the darkened theater interior, likening it to being in a church service with a certain liturgy and solemnness. In the most interesting part of this book, where we find Lindsay referring explicitly to Swedenborg on two separate places, is when he claims the photoplays, or moving pictures, work like hieroglyphics and form a kind of picture writing. Behind each hieroglyphic trace in the set gestures and forms of films, Lindsay believed, there lurked a higher spiritual meaning. And it was up to the prophet magician, in his words, the prophet magician of the filmmaker to create work that used these hieroglyphics responsibly. Lindsay's book closes on a utopian apocalyptic tone, claiming that this new technology will create a new way of thinking in pictures with the dawn of a new spiritual era unleashed by this enormously popular new art form and entertainment. And I want to now read with you two paragraphs in the very end of Lindsay's book to give you a sense of this sense, where he entreats filmmakers and artists in the photoplay to turn to the book of Revelations to help ground the making of a new Jerusalem in the new world of America. So this is Lindsay at the end of this book, sounding a very Swedenborgian sort of note in its use of the New Jerusalem and apocalypse for a utopian new age. Author, producer, photographer, who would prophesy, read the last book in the Bible, not to copy it in form and color, but that its power and grace and terror may enter into you. Delineate in your own way, as you are led on your own Patmos, the picture of our land redeemed. After fasting and prayer, let the Spirit conduct you till you see in definite line and form the throngs of the brotherhood of man, the colonnades where the arts are expounded, the gardens where the children dance. And here's one more sense of this in Lindsay. This is towards the very end of this final chapter. Scenario writers, producers, photoplay actors, and dowers of exquisite films, sects using special motion pictures for a predetermined end, all you who are taking the work as a sacred trust, I bid you Godspeed. Let us resolve that whatever America's tomorrow may be, she shall have a day that is beautiful and not crass, spiritual, not material. Let us resolve that she shall dream dreams deeper than the sea and higher than the clouds of heaven, that she shall come forth crowned and transfigured with her statesmen and wizards and saints and sages about her, with magic behind her and miracle before her. This is a really incredible moment in the first book of film criticism that sets up cinematography as a sacred art that has an apocalyptic calling to bring about a new Jerusalem in the new world. So, Vachel Lindsay was not alone among the early 20th century avant garde for turning to Swedenborg, however. Around the same time that he was working on that book, and even a bit earlier, pioneering painters of abstract art gravitated towards Swedenborg's descriptions of a spiritual world that was beyond space and time, as well as his doctrine of correspondences. To varying degrees, artists like Hilma af Klint, whose painting is pictured to the left here, and Vasily Kandinsky, to the right, found these ideas in Swedenborg, which were often mediated through French symbolism. They found that they helped them break new grounds in painting that was meant not to realistically depict 3 dimensions or figures or a narrative, but to show the true inner spiritual nature of reality, the world of feeling, rendered free by pure color and form. I've mentioned Hilma af Klint, a Swedish painter in Stockholm who was a theosophist and reader of Swedenborg, Vasily Kandinsky. A third person here who's very significant is František Pupka, who was a Hungarian-born painter and a deep reader of Swedenborg. And this painting here, Amorpha, Fugue in 2 Colors, was one of the first abstract paintings ever exhibited in Paris in 1912. And you can note in Kupka's title, and also in the prior painting by Kandinsky, the turn towards music in these abstract paintings, calling them fugues or improvisations. Kandinsky's, if we go back a slide here, this is Improvisation 28. I believe this is in the Guggenheim in New York or the Art Institute of Chicago. I can't remember where, but it's one of Kandinsky's paintings here in the United States. It's like Kupka's painting, it's a blending of sense perception, what we might call synesthesia, which was very important to these artists, and some of them found resonance in Swedenborg's own descriptions of the spiritual world, where the spoken language of angels takes on visual form, or various ideas has scent and smell. So these abstract experiments in painting, tinted with Swedenborgian dissolutions of time and space and doctrines of correspondence that made color have a spiritual valence and power. This deeply impressed early filmmakers, especially in Germany, who wanted to turn the moving picture into a kind of painting. And I want to now look at one example of this, a sequence of a movie by the German expressionist artist Walter Ruttmann from his Lichtspiel, Opus 1, Light Play, his first opus. Walter Ruttmann had been trained as a painter, and in these filmic works, he painted directly onto different panes of glass, which he then filmed, stopping the frame after every brushstroke and wiping the wet color onto the glass. And we're just going to watch a few minutes now of Ruttmann's Lichtspiel, and as we watch, I would encourage you to try and let go of any expectations for realism or a story or the like, to treat this as you would seeing an abstract painting by Kandinsky or Kupka or Hilma af Klint. What are the moods? What are the feelings these colors and the forms evoke? Now, this would have been silent and likely performed to modern avant-garde classical music in the gallery or theater space where Ruttmann's films were shown. And in the modern era, there have been a number of different musical pieces his silent films have been set to. So what we're going to look at now has some music that informs the play of color and light as well. And before I start the film, some of you may be Netflix subscribers and watching serial shows and the like. For any of you who have seen the German television series Babylon Berlin, which is set in 1929 Berlin, it's a great show. It's the most lavishly produced German television series ever in the history of German television. The opening and closing credits use some of Ruttman's films. So for those of you who've seen Babylon Berlin on Netflix, this will be quite familiar. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for, given our compressed time. Many of Walter Ruttmann's abstract films are viewable in their entirety with beautiful music on YouTube and Vimeo. I would encourage you to look at those. And even if you haven't seen Babylon Berlin, that German television series, contemporary, which uses these in the credits, this might remind some of you of the Disney movie Fantasia, which was released in 1940. And the opening sequence of Fantasia, which is set to Johann Sebastian Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor, is based heavily on the work of these earlier German filmmakers like Ruttmann, who were influenced by the spiritual abstraction of Kandinsky, of Klimt, and Kupka that we just looked at. So in the next part of our lecture, and in my time remaining, we're going to take a big leap forward into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s to look at the Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman and the ways he was impacted by Swedenborgian thought. And this work is much more figurative, narrative. It's not dealing with the same tropes of abstraction that we've just talked about here. Right, so now we're going to talk about Ingmar Bergman, one of the greatest 20th century filmmakers. He was extraordinarily prolific. By the end of Bergman's life, he had directed and produced over 45 feature films, including several that received Academy Awards or prizes at the Cannes Film Festival and other such film venues. I had suggested in advance of this mini-course that you watch, if you had the time, 2 films by Bergman, Wild Strawberries and The Seventh Seal. And if we have time after my recorded lecture, we can talk about scenes from these 2 movies. There's actually a lot of striking parallels between Ingmar Bergman and his countryman from the 18th century, Emanuel Swedenborg, pictured here on the right. Both were born into deeply Protestant, Lutheran pietist family households. Both had clergymen pastors for fathers, and in their own ways, both Swedenborg and Bergman wrestled with the theological shadow left by their strong, overweening fathers. Bergman likely became acquainted first with Swedenborg's ideas through his deep study of the Swedish author August Strindberg, whose plays are probably the most significant influence on Bergman's films. Bergman had served for many years as the director of the National Swedish Theatre in Stockholm, where he produced many Strindberg plays. This is a lithograph of Strindberg by the artist Edvard Munch that belonged to Bergman, which he proudly hung in his library, which we can see here on the left. August Strindberg drew a lot of ideas directly from Swedenborg, and like Vachel Lindsay and the other early 20th century avant-garde painters we just talked about, Strindberg was particularly attracted to the idea of a spiritual world that was beyond time and space and embedded in the here and now. Strindberg's most Swedenborgian-influenced play might be the so-called Dream Play from 1901, which Bergman reproduced and directed on 4 separate occasions over 3 decades. Some of you watching might be familiar with Bergman's movie Fanny and Alexander, one of Bergman's last full movies made in the early 1980s. It's one of his most beloved works, especially famous for its opening scene of Swedish Christmas celebrations, and it's certainly his longest, clocking in at over 5 hours in length. It focuses on the life of a little boy, Alexander, who after much hardship and terror at the end of the movie is finally reunited with the entire Ekdahl family in a beautiful scene, and there's a celebration that goes on into the wee hours of the light-filled Swedish morning after the birth of new babies in the family. The matriarch at the center of the movie and the family, the grandmother, has decided to stay up reading rather than going to bed like everybody else in the family. Alexander, her grandson, goes to snuggle on her lap as she begins to read August Strindberg's Dream Play. So the movie ends with Strindberg's most Swedenborgian-influenced text in words that are about dissolving time and space as we hear the sound of a grandfather clock ticking in the background. And that clock ticking, which we're going to hear in a minute, is Bergman's actual grandfather's clock from his grandfather, which he uses as a sound effect in many of his movies. If you hear a tick-tock in the background of a Bergman film, it's almost always his actual grandfather's clock. So we're now going to watch this brief scene. It's just a minute long. It will be in Swedish without subtitles, and after we've watched it, I'll translate the words from the Strindberg play that the grandmother is reading as this film closes.
Allt kan ske, allt är möjligt och sannolikt. Tid och rum existerar icke. På en obetydlig verklighetsgrund spinner inbildningen ut och väver nya mönster.
So those words there, which are a direct quote from Strindberg's Dream Play, the grandmother is saying, everything can happen, everything is possible and probable. Time and space no longer exist. What we call reality is only a flimsy framework. The imagination now spins, weaving new patterns. And that closing scene sort of brings the entire film into a full circle because it opens with a scene of that young boy in his grandmother's lavish apartment. So Ingmar Bergman, the filmmaker, came to own and annotate at least 7 books either by or about Swedenborg. At least that's how many I discovered when I got to be an Ingmar Bergman Fellow and live on his house on the island of Fårö for 2 months in 2016 when I was on sabbatical. I got to explore this extraordinarily beautiful library in the main house where I discovered his books by or about Swedenborg, which are only now beginning to be completely cataloged by Uppsala University in Sweden. This is me in Bergman's library. You can tell I'm just a little bit excited to be in the space, exploring what this great filmmaker read and thought about. Some of the interesting things I found include this copy of Swedenborg's Journal of Dreams, Drömboken, which came into Bergman's hands in 1963 or 1964, and he read and carefully annotated it. And this Journal of Dreams by Swedenborg, I argue, is an important text to situate behind Bergman's perhaps most famous film from the mid-1960s in this period, Persona, which is a deeply disturbing psychological thriller that is charged with a hallucinogenic dreamlike quality and a strong eroticism. 2 things we also find in Swedenborg's Journal of Dreams, of course, sex and the strange. What was most illuminating, however, was to note how Bergman reads a lot of books about Swedenborg towards the end of his life, around the same time that he makes his very last film, Saraband, which he finished in 2003. That last decade of Bergman's life had been haunted by loss. His dear wife, Ingrid, had passed away in the mid-1990s, and Bergman was shaken up by the sense that his wife's spirit was still somehow with him. In the movie Saraband, one of the main characters is also mourning and grieving his dead wife. Besides the books in Bergman's library, I also studied some of the furniture. Bergman was certainly an eccentric genius, and he sometimes drew and sketched on whatever furniture he had at his hand. So here, at his bedside table, next to his bed, you can see him drawing out the schema for his Saraband film. It is filled with reflections on dreams, drömmen, terror, and the dead. So, in one of Lars Bergqvist's books about Swedenborg that Bergman is reading at this time, which has never been translated and published into English, unfortunately, the Biblioteket I Lusthuset, Tio Uppsätze av Swedenborg, the library in the summer house, 2 essays on Swedenborg, I found this astonishing page. Here, Bergqvist is talking about how good spirits after death become angels and messengers that communicate with the living. Bergman underlined this statement emphatically, and he then scrawled in the space below in very large emphatic letters, closed by an exclamation point, Ingrid en ängel nu. Ingrid is an angel now. My dead wife is an angel here and now, is the sense that carries. So I want to end my time talking about Bergman by showing a brief clip from a documentary that was made 4 years before Bergman died in 2007. Most of it is filmed in his house on the coast on Fårö Island. In the clip we will watch, Bergman will talk about his dead wife, Ingrid, and his own beliefs about death and the afterlife. This will all be, of course, with subtitles. This documentary then cuts to a scene from the Saraband movie that I just mentioned, the one that is sketched out on the bedside table, where one of the grieving characters is reflecting on his dead wife while sitting in a church. As we watch, we should think of how reading Swedenborg for Bergman confirmed his sense that his wife Ingrid was an angel now.
Det stora problemet, det förkrossande problemet, och det var då när Ingrid dog för exakt nästan 8 år sedan. Och då logiskt så sa jag ju mig själv att jag kommer aldrig att se Ingrid mera. Hon är borta för evigt. Men sen är det då det här märkvärdiga att jag upplever Ingrids närhet, särskilt här på Fårö, och upplever den intensivt. Och så tänker jag det att jag kan ju inte uppleva hennes närhet om hon inte finns. Och då var den här operationen, det var en kemisk reaktion. Det var inte den riktiga döden, utan det var en konstgjord död. Och i den riktiga döden så kanske det är helt enkelt så att Ingrid väntar på mig, att hon finns. Och att hon kommer mig till mötes.
Nu för tiden tänker jag ofta på döden. Jag tänker så här. En morgon går jag skogsvägen ner mot älven. Det är en höstdag, dimmigt, alldeles vindstilla, alldeles tyst. Då ser jag någon borta vid grinden. Hon kommer emot mig. Hon har sin blå jeanskjol, sin blå kofta. Hon är barfota. Håret har hon i en tjock fläta. Och hon kommer emot mig. Anna kommer emot mig borta vid grinden. Och då förstår jag att jag är död. Sen händer det märkligaste. Jag tänker, är det så här enkelt? Vi går hela livet och undrar över döden, det som följer och inte följer. Och så är det så här enkelt.
Thanks everyone for listening to that lecture, and I'm delighted that my friend Becky is here to moderate the Q&A following that presentation.
Hi everyone. We just watched Spiritual Cinema at the Swedenborg at the movies, and I also want to welcome my friend Dr. Devin Zuber, the Associate Professor of American Studies and Literature at the Center for Swedenborgian Studies in Berkeley, California. Thank you so much, Devin, for taking the time to put this together for us and joining us today. So we have a few minutes, and a bunch of questions came through. First, I'd like to ask you about the synesthesia that you mentioned. Can you go further into that and explain to some people what that might be who may not know?
Sure, yeah, and I should have explained that a little better in my presentation. So synesthesia is the crossing of wires of sense perception, something auditory that takes on a visual component, or smell and taste getting switched around and mixed up. And in the 19th century, this becomes something that painters are really into. They think about their painters as sounds. We had a great comment on the Facebook page from my friend Andrew Dodd about Whistler and his nocturnes. And for a lot of abstract painters that were reading Swedenborg, they really gravitated towards moments in Swedenborg's descriptions of the spiritual world that are synesthetic, where the spoken language of angels takes on a visual form, or ideas smell like things. They can smell like roses or flowers, or something evil stinks. And this kind of mixing of senses is part of the reason why some of those early abstractionists, which then bleeds into the film I showed by Walter Whitman, are interested in the synesthesia in Swedenborg. So it points towards an inner reality, one could say, by reordering sense perception, by cross-wiring them together in a way.
Really neat. I've just recently learned about it, so it's fascinating to me to hear the perspectives of how the synesthesia happens, and colors and tastes and smells and everything. It's really cool.
Yeah.
One of the questions. Oh, go ahead.
What does I wanted to say that I'm not a biologist, but of course some of the artists, and we have people watching who are also artists, are born with synesthesia. It's an actual physiological perception that when they see certain colors, they hear sound or even smell certain things. So it's embedded in brain cognition and how the brain works.
It's fascinating. One of the comments that came through is from Kevin B. And he asked, my fear of picture hieroglyphics is that they can lead towards reinforcing stereotypes. How do we value the externals that lead to the internals without causing damage to groups of people who are often characterized for expedience of a quick emotional connection?
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Kevin. That's a great question to bring to Vachel Lindsay, who in 1916 publishes this first book of film criticism, and he's really interested in Swedenborg's correspondences and writings about hieroglyphics to think about film with these sort of set gestures and modes. That text is deeply problematic. It also talks about the film Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, which was groundbreaking in its time for what it did with cinematography. It's also deeply racist. It was famously shown in the White House by Woodrow Wilson, and is part of sort of a Confederate lost cause ideology that cast in very stereotypical ways African Americans into a certain mode. Lindsay himself was sort of progressive in his politics, but he wasn't above stereotypes. And he viewed African Americans as sort of an embodiment of the primitive that he saw as resistant to the forces of modernization. So it's problematic in his work. And here we can see where some of Swedenborg's ideas accorded with racist ideas of the early 20th century. So I'm glad we had that question, because I don't want to hold up Lindsay's book on a pedestal. It's also very much part of the early 20th century in the way film history is wrapped up with white supremacy.
Right. Another great question that came through was from Rosalind T. And she asked, I've often had the experience of watching a movie and thinking that the writers and directors must have read Swedenborg. Do you think that that's more likely, or that the Swedenborgian concepts have become more or less commonplace or part of our current culture?
Good question. For me as a historian, I'm always keen on trying to find the smoking gun in the archive, right? So tracing Ingmar Bergman, reading Swedenborg. I think in some ways, art has always been a space for the imagination and longing. So cinema continues our thoughts about death, a space after death, desire and love. And some of those are universal things. They're very sharp and acute in our Swedenborgian tradition and heritage. And I think film, if we look at its roots in these figures I'm holding up, like Vachel Lindsay, but even some contemporary figures like Nathaniel Dorsky I quoted from, there might be something inherently spiritual or devotional in the transformational aesthetic that certain films can unfold for us. So for Swedenborgians watching this and for us thinking about this, that's where I see sort of a tie-in with regeneration and models of spiritual growth and our own journeys. How might films be an aid in that? But I would encourage Roz and others, just keep your eyes and ears open. You never know when you might find a link or a buy-in. As a historian, though, I roll up my sleeves in the archive and I look for the actual trace of ideas, as you can see in Bergman's library.
Yeah, very cool. Jonathan C. asks, is it the bright colors that correlate to heaven? And all of the works that you've shown here seem to have that in common.
Great question, Jonathan. Thanks. And you're an artist yourself, so I'm sure you've thought about this deeper than me. I wish I had an artistic aptitude. I don't. I just have fun writing and watching movies like this. It's interesting, and we just watched some Bergman clips. Bergman himself found the bright white light to be terrifying, and a lot of his movies. We had another comment on the Facebook feed about Bergman's movie Cries and Whispers, and there too you can see how the unflinching, unrelentless light of the Scandinavian summer is something horrifying for Bergman. He much preferred the fall and a space of twilight and shadow in his movies. So I don't think there's a something universal per se in this, even though, of course, in Swedenborg's theology, this is there, that he says, red equals this, blue equals that. These have valences that tie to symbolic meanings of good and truth. But I think when we look at the broader history of art, it's often a much more subjective kind of thing. The Ruttmann Lichtspiel, the light play film I showed from the 20s, that beautiful abstract thing done on the glass plates, I think there it's fun to sort of just take away your preconceived ideas and let the images and the music flow and think about how does it make you feel, that there's a tension between the dynamic forms, the contrasting colors that tell a kind of story of emotions that you respond to effectively as a viewer. And maybe there in our physiology, to go back to thinking of like synesthesia, there might be something about a universal way certain colors work and how they make us feel that become the basis for spiritual symbolism we find in the films.
Great, that's awesome. You and I were having a little quick chat during the presentation, and we have a couple more minutes. I found it interesting that you came across these films that are so relevant to Swedenborg. Can you just go into a little bit more detail about how you found them in the first place?
Right. Yeah. Well, some of it has to do with just keeping your eyes and ears open. Maybe this is related to Roz's question too, and getting a hunch that there's some kind of connection, and waiting for the opportunity to go deeper to the archive and have it unfold. So my next book that I'm working on, one of several next book project ideas, is about 1950s, 60s counterculture in the Bay Area here in California. The way that different artists, poets, writers were using different esoteric and spiritual systems to make their art. And one of those figures in the book is a guy named Harry Smith, who everyone here is probably familiar with because he created the Anthology of American Folk Music, which the Smithsonian brought out, which was sort of the folk Bible for Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. And Harry Smith was also a filmmaker, deeply interested in alchemy. So trying to pursue Smith's craft as someone who tried to turn his cinematography into painting led me to Vachel Lindsay. And when I realized that Lindsay talked about hieroglyphics, I thought, wow, that sounds kind of Swedenborgian. And sure enough, once I looked more into Lindsay, I found this fascination with Swedenborg's ideas of language and spiritual signs and semiotics that become part of Lindsay's hieroglyphic approach to film. And this is a great opportunity to take some of those connections that you have a hunch about, that you research a bit, and try them out before the public. And down the road, I'm hoping I can weave this more coherently together with the book, which for the Harry Smith chapter, we'll talk more about this early cinematography history, which has a magical and mystical component. We often sort of put film and the history of Hollywood into a very secular kind of box. But if we look at these early figures and during World War I, there's a fascinating sense that this new form, this new medium, has a deep spiritual potential that could transform society and culture. And that's fun to play around with if we think about George Dole's opening talk we had for the convention today about where are we in the 21st century with Swedenborg's sort of amorphous idea of what the new church is and where it's going. Maybe cinema has a role to play in some of that as a new mode of a new medium of communication.
Definitely. And I think we'll all look forward to reading more about that when you develop your thoughts. We're about at time. I thank you again, Dr. Devin, for joining us. And I'm inviting all of you who are watching to continue your conversation in the comments section as long as you choose to. Coming up next is Dr. David Feckety with his mini course on the death of God in T.S. Eliot and the death of the church in Swedenborg. So see you guys then. Bye, Devin. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks. Yep. Take care.